Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here with us for today's online event on Pandemic Proofing Society, partnered with the Institute of High Performance Computing, A*STAR, and Hexagon, MSc Software Corporation. My name is Alethea from the National Supercomputing Centre Singapore, or NSCC for short. For those of you who are not familiar with us, NSCC is a national research infrastructure funded by the National Research Foundation of Singapore. NSCC is Singapore's first petascale supercomputer facility that provides high-performance computing and resources to all local research institutes, institutes of higher learning, government agencies, and companies in both the public and private sector. HPC resources are beneficial in a variety of ways and in a number of different sectors. It enables research of the highest computational complexity and data intensiveness in areas like advanced modeling and simulation, artificial intelligence, and big data analytics to be completed in shorter time spans. If you are interested, do find out more about NSCC and HPC at www.nscc.sg. Before we get started with the talk, please do note that if you have any questions, do post them into the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. We will address your questions during our Q&A and panel discussion segment at the end of the presentations. During the panel discussion segment, you may also choose to raise your hand and we will bring you on screen to speak. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Lee Tong Yen, who will be facilitating today's session. Dr. Lee is currently a HPC application analyst at NSCC. He was trained in theoretical and computational physics and has done research in the areas of phenomenological theory of ferroelectricity and molecular dynamic simulations of carbon nanostructures. At NSCC, he serves as a technical middleman between users and NSCC's HPC systems, as well as work with new users to translate their computational requirements into a functional HPC work plan. So let me introduce Dr. Lee and bring him and let him lead the webinar. Dr. Lee, please.
Okay. Hi, hi everyone. My name is Lee Tong Yen, and I'm currently the HPC application analyst at NSCC. Today, I will be moderating this webinar where we will talk about HPC and its role in mitigating or solving problems posed by the pandemic. Okay, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Chang. He's a senior scientist and deputy director of the Fluid Dynamic Department, Institute of High Performance Computing, IHPC, A*STAR. He co-leads the department to pre-position, steer, and strengthen department strategic direction, as well as mentor and groom talents. He's also the innovation lead for green technology for marine, offshore, oil and gas, MOOG in short, to promote cross-cutting initiatives that integrate IHPC competencies and department strengths in the field of MOOG sector. Over 15 years of working experience in computational fluid dynamics CFD for research and industry. He led and or involved in numerous projects in the field of green shipping, manufacturing process, and sustainability. Especially for this year, he is leading a team of computational scientists with fluid dynamics expertise to develop advanced computational modeling of airflow and airborne droplets dispersion. The team has developed, verified, and used the model to understand how droplet in-flight characteristics and their final destination are affected by a range of factors and interdependent interactions. The scientific outcomes will be shared in the talk, so without further ado, let us welcome our first speaker, Dr. Kang.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dong Yan, for the kind introduction, and thank you, NSCC, for the invitation. So my name is Chang, and I'm glad that I'm invited today to give this talk entitled Powering Airflow and Droplet Spread Study with Supercomputer. So before I start to go to the content, please bear with me a minute or two to let me share what IHPC are doing. So at IHPC, we co-innovate through deep multidisciplinary modeling, simulation, and knowledge-driven AI. So at IHPC, we have 7 departments and 5 cross-departmental initiatives. So among these departments, I and the teams that we're working on this current droplets, airflow and droplet spread is from fluid dynamic departments. So what we did is actually in the department, we developed digital representations of the flow phenomena using mathematical equations and law of physics. And then we solve this using supercomputer with the resources that are kindly provided by NSCC. So in field analytic departments, we actually categorize ourselves into 4 groups that we develop capability in the area of coupled and complex flow, engineering fluid flow, computational for optimization and design of engine system, and last but not least, the physics-based data-driven modeling. So let's come to the discussion or the sharing of this webinar. So we're aware that during vocalizing activities such as sneezing, coughing, talking, and breathing, there are respiratory droplets that emit from a person, and it is being catalyzed into a droplet, which is defined that with the size that larger than 5 to 10 micron, and then for the aerosol, which is smaller than 5 micron. So droplet were actually emitted from the mouth and then were lingering in the air, spread and transmit in the air. In order for us to better understand the droplet transmission, at IHPC, particularly from our department, fluid dynamics, we actually build upon what we have, the capability that we have, and to develop an airflow and droplet dispersion model, to particularly to understand how the droplets being spread. In this context, we're looking into the vocalizing activity of a coughing. Utilizing this modeling and simulation capability, we then can visualize how the droplets being spread. We can then quantify the number of virus loads that actually were landed on various locations, including the human subject, and subsequently we can analyze and assess the risk of transmission and infection, so that this can be better understand and give a more informed decision. So in this talk today, I will categorize into 3 sections. So the first section, I will share more into details of how we actually models the fundamental modeling steps and procedure. Subsequently, I will share some of the underlying physics of how the droplets being governed or being affected by different environmental parameters. And last but not least, how we actually apply what we have developed here and how we derive a theorist analysis to apply into different applications area. So let's look at the first section, which is the fundamental, how we actually model the details and the detailed steps in the modeling. Before going into the parameters that we consider in the modeling process, let me share with you how the coughing process is being categorized. So we actually segment it into 3 sections. So you can see in the picture over here, during a coughing activity, there will be 3 stages of the processes. The first one is that there will be an expulsion of turbulent air jet from a mouth of an infected person. Accompanied with this jet, there will be a wide range of droplet size, and that will actually interact between the flow and droplets, whereby the momentum, the heat, and mass transfer will occur in the second stage we name it as flow-droplet interaction. Subsequently, there are different forces acting on the droplets during the inflight, and therefore it will actually affect the dispersion and whether it will be settling or depositions into different locations, which is the stage number 3. So of course, this is what I mentioned is the coughing process, but this also applies for other talking and singing activity. Just the difference is that the strength of the forces, the size of the distribution will vary between different vocalizing activity. So particularly for this study, we are looking very much on the coughing process. The key factor that we are taking into considerations are shown in here. There are 8 of them. The first is the time-dependent airflow rate that determines the expulsion force and the fluid volume that emitted from an infected person. This is whereby we getting from a literature, and the graph shown on your right, top right, is where we actually models or implement it as a boundary initial conditions that mimic the expulsion force during one coughing. The second factors that we take into account is the droplet size distribution. That is actually shown in the bottom right corner. There will be a large range of droplet size ranging from as small as 2 micron to all the way as large as about 1 millimeter. And this is the distributions that actually we incorporated into our CFD model. The subsequent few, 3, 4, 5, like for example, the cough angle, the mouth opening area, the normal breathing, all these are a realistic representation on how a human's cough and subsequently is followed by a normal breathing process. And for number 3 and 4, that also will determine how the expulsion force that the droplet have, the initial aspect of it, or when he emitted from a person's mouth. 6 and 7 are more applicable and more significant in our tropical region, where we incorporate the evaporations as well as the non-volatile particles. So evaporations, meaning that the droplets, when during his inflight, they will actually shrink in size because of the hot environments that we have over here in Singapore. And during the shrinking process, there will be to a certain stage, they will stop the evaporation process due to the existence of the non-volatile particle. Subsequently, the number 8 is whereby we not only consider the physical sciences, we also look into the biological effect, whereby we incorporated the virus load in the droplets that we take into account during our analysis. So I particularly would like to highlight the point number 6 and number 7. In the number 6, which is the evaporations, before we incorporate this evaporations model into our CFD framework, what we need to do is actually to compare whether the model is accurate, whether the model is benchmarked against literature. So on the top row, there will be two graphs. One is on the left, the other one is on the right. The one is on the left is from our model, and the one on the right is the literature from Red Rose. So there are three categories of graphs line in the graph. The first category is represented a small little droplets we name as 1 micron, followed by 10 microns, and subsequently 100 micron. Each of these category of size, there are 3 effects of relative humidity from RH of 0 to 60% to 80%. So comparative between these two graphs, you can see that the comparison is pretty well, whereby we compare across the sizes across the RH with this literature. The result is very good. Subsequently, we actually look into the second validation where we compare with the experiments for another literature. The red dot is actually the experiment data, and the blue line is actually from our simulations model. Because of the availability of the data, we only look into 2 sizes, and this although is relatively larger, which is about 300 to 600 millimeter, but at least we have some kind of confidence that the model are validated in such a sense that we are able to capture the evaporation process fairly accurately. The next one that I would like to touch on is on the non-volatile particles. Through the literatures that early of our study, we found that many, whether not considering evaporation or some of them consider evaporation, they are considered as a complete evaporation. In other words, the droplet will actually evaporate till it will disappear in the volume of space. So what is unique for our study is that we consider this non-volatile particle. And why is it realistic? Because during our coughing, in the saliva, there will be a wide range of components in the saliva. It includes the water, protein, lipid, carbohydrate, DNA, and salt. So the percentage of these non-volatile particles as compared to water is about 6.5%, and of course the water is the remaining, which is 93.5%. So in other words, when we consider this effect, the 93.5% of water will evaporate fully, and into a certain stage that this 6.5% of the volume of the droplet will remain as a residuals, and it will actually carry and lingering in the air. So these are the 2 uniqueness of the approach that we currently adopt. Now let's look into the second stage, which is understanding the science. What is the importance of the underlying physics? So having developed the CFD models, so what we do is actually understand systematically on each of the parameters, how it actually affect the droplet spread, how it actually affect the evaporation and the size of the droplets. So the first one that I would like to share with you is on the effect of non-volatile particles on droplet evaporation. So this is a graph that actually shows you the effect. Looking at the graph, the y-axis is the ratio of the droplets and the x-axis is the time of evaporation. There are a couple of lines in the graph ranging from the 8 microns, pure water and salt, followed by the second category, 24 micron, pure water and the combination of water and salt. And lastly is 50 micron, which also the same, we have water and salt. So in short, what you can observe over here is that a very small droplets, like example in this 8 micron, the droplet is actually less affected by non-volatile content. But in the larger droplets, the evaporation time is actually much longer. And it actually demonstrates over here is that for the 50 micron, the droplets with non-volatile particle, in this case salt content, you will have 3 times larger evaporation time than the pure water droplets. And below here show the conditions where the simulation is considering, which is the wind speed of 2 meters per second, the ambient air temperature of 30 degrees C, RH of 84%. The droplet initial temperature is where we take from the temperature of the body, which is about 36 degrees C. So all these conditions are based on the average conditions that where Singapore have. And subsequently, next is how the relative humidity and the size will affect the droplet dispersion. So the graphs show over here, the y-axis represent the x, which is the horizontal distance the droplet will actually travel, and the x-axis is actually the droplet size. Looking at this graph, we can see that the droplet size, when it becomes larger, it will actually evaporate slower. This is mainly because when the droplet has larger volume, it will have this ratio of volume to surface higher, and therefore it's much difficult to evaporate, or it becomes evaporated a bit slower. Because of this, the gravity effect becomes very prominent, very dominant, and it will affect the downward trajectory of the droplet, and it will land it in a very short horizontal distance. So from this graph, we also can see the effect of relative humidity. So if you look vertically upwards, so you can compare the red line, which is the relative humidity of 60%, the green is 70%, and the blue is 84%. So comparing these 3 lines, we can see that for RH, which is lower, the droplet will actually travel further. The reason is because when at lower RH, the droplet will have higher evaporation rate, therefore it will shrink faster. When it shrinks faster, the effect of the gravity will be less dominant as compared to other forces, for example, this case, the drag, and therefore it will actually be carried further away downstream. Similar condition of wind speed, ambient air temperature as the droplet initial temperature is also considered as per the graph earlier. And the last effect that I want to share with you is the wind speed on the droplet dispersion. So this graph shows you the fraction of droplets with horizontal distance that exceed 1 meter from the source at 10 seconds. So I can observe over here is that there are 4 graphs. One is whereby the wind is actually windless or 0 meter per second, followed by 1 meter per second, 2 meter per second, and 3 meter per second. So what is interesting over here is that, we understand with no wind condition, the droplets that actually exit 1 meter will be less, about 20% for this case. But with wind speed, because of the drag from the wind, more droplet will actually exit the 1 meter in 10 seconds. But what is interesting over here is the 2 meter per second, because we intuitively know that with higher wind speed, there should be more fractions of droplet being carried exiting 1 meter in 10 seconds. But the reason for this, that 2 meters per second, you have lower fractions of droplet is mainly due to the wake that exists because of the human subject that's standing in the stream of the air. So this wake effect will actually entrench the droplets and therefore will affect the fractions of the droplets that exit this 1 meter from the source at 10 seconds. So similar conditions are also adopted here. So in summary, the forces that acting the inflight droplet trajectory are namely the drag, gravity, inertia. And what is more importantly is the evaporation, because they play a very significant role in determining the droplet behavior. As just now I mentioned, because droplet evaporation will actually shrink the droplet, and that will change the competing effect between the forces of the drag, gravity, and inertia. So from this study, actually, we can categorize the regimes of the droplets characteristic into three. One is the drag dominant regime, which is on your far left. The other one is a gravity dominant regime, which is on your far right side. So in between is a drag, the competing between the drag as well as the gravity forces, depending on the local conditions that this droplet will be in. So in the drag dominated, of course, when the drag is higher, you actually become carried further away. Gravity dominated is because of the gravity, you will actually pull down, and then you will have a shorter horizontal distance. So in between is something have to be very dependent on the local condition. So this is the drag dominant is mainly on the small droplet. The gravity dominant is mainly on the large droplets. So these are in between of the small into the small and the large droplet. So more details, you can actually refer to this publication that we have recently published in November. The title of the article is Dispersion of Evaporating Cough Droplet in Tropical Outdoor Environments. These are featured articles in Inflight. Last 2 weeks, you may also aware that there are a few publicities regarding the work that we have conducted, and this is a snapshot of what have been showed in the press. So the last section that I would like to share with you is that after we have developed the framework, after we have understanding some level of physics that governing the droplet in-flight characteristic, the question now comes into how actually we can apply what we know into evaluating the droplet transport for various venues. So this is where I will share in this section. So what we actually come out is we call this as tier risk analysis. So on your left is an infectivity based on virus load, and this is where you use the computer simulation. Because in the computer simulation, we are able to accurately track and quantify the virus load or the droplets that actually landed on the different location, and therefore we actually can estimate the virus load on different location. So the value over here is in consultation with NCID, National Center of Infectious Disease. So what we have over here is less than 58 virus copy, we name it as low. Larger than 840 copy, we actually name it as high, and in between is medium risk. So concurrently, our colleague from Emory, they also did experiments on the smoke testing. They also derived another set of tier risk analysis. So what they do is that they have a smoke generator and they have sensors. So during the calibrations, they actually put these two, the sensor and the generator at 5 meters apart, because we know that that will have a low risk. And the amount that they measured is actually 5% from the source of the emitted particles. And when they put it smaller than about 2 meters distancing, they measure about 40%. So they name it as more than 40% as high risk. So in between, it is a medium risk. But particularly for this webinar, I would like to zoom a bit more on our infectivity on the computer simulation. How actually we derive on 58 and 840. So on the top left, you can see the graph over here. So this is the virus load per milliliter of the saliva. It fluctuates a lot during different days of hospitalization. So this is where we actually take some of this data to use it in our computation simulation, because once we know the number of droplets landed on certain persons, certain locations, we know the volume, and from there we can derive the virus load based on this graph. The second one is based on the value where we have the correlation between the RT-PCR as well as the number of copies of the viruses. So based on here, we consult the NCID whereby the CD value of 34 is something is not culturable, and we based on this to actually derive from this graph to get about 58 copies. So this is whereby lower than 58 copies is named as low risk. In terms of high risk, this is a paper by NCID. They actually have measured the number of virus in the air, and it's about 3,500, and this is exposure of 30 minutes. Based on some mathematical calculations, considering also the average minutes of inhalations, we actually can derive 840 copy, and this is the high risk. And in between is the medium risk. So having developed this theories analysis, we do also compare with other study, of course, not particularly on SARS-CoV-2, because it is relatively new. We actually compare to other diseases. So for example, there are also diseases from literatures regarding adenovirus type 4 is about 6.6 copy. They have also other like the precedence of this COVID, which is COVID-1 is about 280 copy, and so on and so forth. They also have some related to COVID-2, some reported to 10 to 100, some reported at 330. So these are at least a benchmark that we are actually about the same orders as what literature have reported. So understand all this, then we actually can conduct a series of study, and these are the list of case study that we conducted. So just to highlight that, of course, all of this study is not only for computer simulations, we actually work very closely with our sister IHPC that they did the experiments. So for this intervention measure, we look into the facial, whether it's in the outside-in transmission, meaning that the one that is coughing, the one that's talking, there's a wearing mask. The other one is inside-out transmission, with a listener that actually wearing the face shield. And also we look into perceptual, and we also look into polywomas as well as the face shield. So this is on the interventions measures that we look into it. Besides that, we also go into working a lot of different case study, ranging from the outdoor theater, amphitheater, natural ventilator space, public transport, exhibition hall, meeting pot, place of worship, indoor theater. So although this setting is one as what I just mentioned, but each of this one setting, there are a lot of scenarios that we are looking into. For example, we look into different space distancing, whether there's a one empty seat, two empty seat, one empty row, and so on and so forth. So in short, there are a lot of scenarios that actually the team have conducted. So taking this opportunity, I would like to thank NSCC, because we need to complete all these scenario in a very short time span. And with the resources and the support by NSCC, we are able to actually deliver this in time. So I would like to highlight, because of timing, I only can able to highlight one case study that we actually conducted, and this is where we look into the indoor theater. And the risk that we are looking at is on the coughing audience. So this is where we look into someone that is cough. There's one person who cough, but everyone is not wearing mask. So this is a geometry, as well as the air path that showing how the airflow is moving. So this is whereby you have looking into the aircon supply, which is the blue, aircon return, which is the red, and this is the audience seat and the performance area. So before we look into the details on how the droplet spread, we will have to validate or see how the airflow, whether we are capturing correctly or not. So on the left side is how our simulations predicts the airflow patterns. So due to the configuration of the supply and return, the airflow will have this circulation zone whereby the air will actually uplift towards the audience seat. And similarly, from our colleagues from Emory, they did this smoke test, and it well represents the airflow that's similar to what we actually observe in the simulation. So because we would like to generalize some of this study that we have, we also find from literature, and we observe that although some of these configurations of the supply and return differ, but the airflow pattern within the cinema have similarity with what we're actually doing here in the indoor theater. So in other words, means that some of this study can be extended and applied into the cinema context. So this is showing the droplet flow, the droplet flows path. So this is actually the animation, but I can't see for now. So what you have over here is the droplet actually coming from the mouth of the person, and then it will actually go forward. Subsequently, will actually, because of the thermal buoyancy of the human subject, you are actually going upwards and flowing through the droplet return. So lastly, I will share with you the strength and limitation of the study. So the strength of this study is that we are able to couple the experimentation and the computer simulations together, and this will enable us to actually cost validations of our finding. And in terms of limitations, we are looking into one coughing actions where it's only directed to the front, and we also assume that human subject is static. And there are also a lot of these unknown for time being regarding on the droplet transmission. For example, the viability of the virus, the duration exposure time to get someone infected. So these still remain unknown and is an area of R&D. And the next point is that beside droplet transmission, which is a very core study of this presentation, there are also other routes of infection, such as formite, such as others infection that occur outside of the scenario that being studied here. The last thing I would like to highlight is that droplet being light actually very easily affected by the change in the environmental condition, the speed change, the temperature, the RH change, the behavior of the droplet will also change. So as far as what we're concerned, we hope that this study can be as generalizable as possible so that it can cover a broader range for and then can reach further reach to different kind of condition. And last but not least, the study just now I shared with you is about the risk-based analysis to highlight that although we say low risk, but doesn't mean it's actually no risk. And the last one is, which is the most important slide of all, is this acknowledgement slide. So all this make possible because we have a good team over here at A-Star. We have a strong support from the 2ED, Kang as Xianjun. And also we have a great team from IHPC. We have Zheng Hui, George, Jin Zhun, Zhong Liang, Hong Ying, and Feng Yu. As well as in Emery, we have Eddie, Anton, Jing Yi, Daniel, Debbie, Ivan. So all of us, we work very closely together to ensure all the requests are able to cover in times and also in a good quality of research. And last but not least, of course, very good cooperation with different agencies from NSCC itself, from the great support for the compute resources and the technical support, and to NCID, NCCY, STB, NAC, BCA, as well as LTA. With this, I think for any further information and any other cooperation opportunity, please kindly contact me. Here is my email address as well as my contact number. Thank you so much for the kind attention.
Okay, thank you, Chang Wei, for the very interesting talk. So please allow me a minute to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Karthik Sundaraj is an expert in experimental and computational fluid dynamics specialized in the areas of high-speed flows and aerodynamics with special interest in electrothermal and biomedical research. Karthik has the perfect combination of an experienced researcher, a successful academician, and an emerging technology strategist. Karthik now works as the technical manager at Indo-Pacific at Hexagon, MSC. In his role, Karthik is responsible for the technical and business development activities of CFD solutions and also handles academic skill development and transformational business initiatives. Karthik holds a master's degree from in aerospace engineering from Brunel University and bachelor's in industrial engineering. He has recently submitted his doctoral research thesis in high-speed flow physics using experimental and computational methods. Congratulations. And yeah, Karthik, you can begin now.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that wonderful introduction. So first of all, let me start by thanking NSCC for this opportunity. And I also would like to thank everybody who is participating today. I think you have made time to listen to us. That's really wonderful. So as Lee introduced, so I basically have an expertise in CFD. So today what we are going to talk about is somewhere related to simulation technologies and how these engineering simulation technologies have really impacted the innovation in the biomedical and healthcare sector. So today, most of my discussion is going to be surrounding the engineering simulations and how they are really accelerating different studies, basically contributing towards better healthcare and medical services. Quickly introducing the company and what we basically do. So I represent Hexagon MSc, and we are into multiple technologies that leads to autonomy of solutions. So today, what I'm talking about falls under the design and simulation sector. Okay, so this is where we have engineering simulation tools through which we do multiple simulations for different industry segments. And as such, today I'll be definitely focusing on how simulation technology has really contributed for medical outbreaks. That is something like the pandemic, COVID, what we are going through now, and how we can address these sort of pandemics with the help of simulation technologies. And then I'll also talk a little bit about how engineering simulations are also helping in advanced healthcare applications. So first of all, what is it that's driving the medical industry? What are the major challenges that they are facing, and why are they looking for innovative solutions? One is definitely the medical device and healthcare market is experiencing significant growth due to greater indices of lifestyle illnesses. So I think as we compare and as we move ahead in life, there are going to be lifestyle-based illnesses, and that is basically inherently a lot of challenges for the medical device vendor, and definitely it is becoming more complex, and people are seeking fail-safe and long-lasting replacements. Right, and the second is the prototyping and the testing process itself is extremely time-consuming. Let us say a prototype time frame is somewhere close to 6 to 8 weeks, post which you don't directly, you cannot use the prototype. So you go into validation phase, you go into testing phase. There are close to 10 million fatigue tests that every prototype has to undergo before it is, even cleared to be used by a human being, because this is a lot involving the life and death scenario. Then, of course, the biocompatibility, that is how a particular device or how a particular medicine is compatible to the human being, right? So that is where a lot of clinical tests and clinical trials are going to happen. Now, typically, I think most of you are already aware, for a medicine to be given to a human being, the clinical trial duration is close to 3 to 5 years. But with current COVID and pandemic, I think we are very quickly trying to come up with medicines by reduced clinical trials. Now, this involves a lot of replacement of trials with the help of simulations and understanding through sampling and artificial intelligence and so on. Now, the other thing is the medical devices are basically changing based on requirements from hospitals, requirements from surgeons. Now, surgeons are becoming, very advanced when they want to do a particular surgery. They take advanced methods. They want to understand engineering synergy with medical. So that is where a lot of synergy now starts to coexist between engineering and medical. So a medical or a surgeon or a doctor will be able to define his problem. Now, where the engineer contributes is by finding out solutions for that medical problem, right? So by different means. Now, lastly, the ever-existing problem is the compliance requirement, right? Now, quality and regulations are one critical factor, and that is where a lot of time is spent by medical and healthcare sectors, because it has to undergo these certifications through regulatory bodies. And they are constantly looking for ways to, reduce this time for compliance testing and certification. Now, when I talk about medical. So we are continuously talking about innovation, designing, development, and so on. So as you notice, I've just put a few images representing what are we looking as a future, right? So of course, most of you are already aware of exoskeleton, but how are we going to use exoskeleton in the future, right? So we are talking about using exoskeleton at a workforce environment so that you have less stress, less fatigue, and so on. Or let us say advanced prosthetics. Now, when I say advanced prosthetic, it means a customized prosthetic made for individual to address their individual requirements. Or let us talk about advanced drug delivery. Now, when I mean advanced drug delivery, a simple example, even Mr. Kang spoke about is targeted drug delivery systems, or let us say aerosols. Now, how does a targeted drug delivery reduce the side effects on a human being? So there are a lot of side effects that a common medicine causes. And how does that reduce when we use targeted drug delivery systems and so on? So I think I've just introduced something like smart autonomous bed. Now, this smart autonomous bed became a topic of interest when the pandemic suddenly kicked in, because a lot of hospitals were looking for smart autonomous beds because they had issue with accessing patients. So a person was not able to directly communicate with the patient, make the patient comfortable, because we were trying to understand what is COVID, how the COVID spreads, and so on. So that was where many of them found the requirement and the need to have a smart autonomous bed, so that we are able to communicate with the patients and still make them feel comfortable, but from a distant location. Now, going forward, how does healthcare really, vitalize CAE simulation or engineering simulation? Of course, engineering simulations adds a lot of value to different areas, different sectors. You can see that I've put pretty much all the areas, starting from cardiovascular, dental, orthopedic, even ophthalmic, that is your maybe designing of lenses, understanding visualizations, and so on, even medical equipment, infusions. So a lot of areas engineering simulation can really contribute to the development phase, from whether it is a medical device design or implementation of medical device, or let us say a drug delivery, or whether it is surgical process, post-surgical process, whatever might be the area. I think we can now take the route of engineering simulation to understand the nature and the complexity of that process. Moving forward, like I mentioned, let me first introduce to you how this CFD simulation, or in generic, the engineering simulation technology, has really contributed during this medical outbreak. How we as a company have really tried to understand about the particle dynamics, and how this particle dynamics is really different for COVID-like scenario and for a non-COVID-like scenarios, and so on. So before I jump into the topic, I wanted to quickly introduce to you what is particle dynamics. So of course, this video gives a very brief understanding of what I mean by particle dynamics. One is what we call as discrete element modeling, right? Where we are trying to understand the interaction between fluids or interaction between particles. So of course, when we do the simulation, we consider fluids in the form of particles, and then try to understand the forces. Why is it important to understand these forces? Is because the entire movement or the entire flow of particles is totally dependent on how these particles interact with each other. Let us say there was a lot of talk during this pandemic about how the particle sticks to a surface, how the particle floats on a free atmosphere, and how does the particle bounce off from a certain surface. A lot of publications have also come out on these particular areas. So the basis about all this is understanding the particle dynamics. Then, of course, the complexity of this increases because the particles are very small in nature. So you need to really discretize the space. So in engineering terms, I'm talking about meshing, which is nothing but discretizing the entire space of study. So when I say discretizing, we are basically dividing the entire space into smaller entities of study and then understanding it by integrating the entire space. And of course, the complexity increases further when you try to couple them. That is, you coupling with air, you coupling with fluid, you coupling with any other agent of any other physics, then the complexity increases. But all the whole, the particle dynamics is a critical factor which adds value to these type of understanding of how the particle really propagates in the air. So first of all, the idea was always, how do we mitigate this infection transmission, right? So starting from day one, people were trying to find ways of containing the infection and reducing the transmission of infection. So there were different researchers, different studies, different countries followed different methods. And we also did a few research to understand what are the different researches and different methods that people are following to mitigate this transmission of infection. One very interesting area was the airway manipulation, because COVID is one such disease, you can say, where you need airway manipulation. That is because of development of lung infection. You really need personal nursing. And when I say personal nursing, it starts with airway manipulation. So what is airway manipulation is nothing but just simply introducing airflow directly to your lungs. Okay. So how can you do this by not transmitting infection to the person who is coming forth to do this particular activity to you? So there were different modifications. I'll speak more about this in the later slide. Then, of course, the distancing norm. So a lot of countries, or most of the countries, came up with distancing between two people or between individuals. Now, how effective is this distancing? And most of the countries introduced the usage of mask or face shields and so on. Now, how is this really impacting the transmission itself? A lot of countries have succeeded by just introducing distancing and mask and innovative way of not communicating with people. So that is one very important area of investigation. The other is people now started using containment wards, right? Now, how do we safeguard multiple people inside this containment wards, like ICUs? Now, that again becomes an important area of study from the perspective of ventilation, circulation, and so on. Then disinfection. I think many countries started doing aerial disinfection because the spread was quite fast and they had to disinfect a large area. Now, they took different methods, but it was very critical to understand how the disinfection is really effective from a large area perspective. So that is one other area we also studied. And starting with distancing effectiveness, so definitely we use multiple CFD techniques to understand different scenarios. So I think people started talking about covering your mouth with hand, then covering your mouth and your face with mask and so on. So different such scenarios were simulated, of course, by considering COVID-like particles, because even till date, there is no clarity on what is the exact dimension, the humidity, the size of this particular COVID particle. But we have taken the SARS-CoV-2, that is the earlier COVID particle characteristics, to typically understand the difference between a normal coughing person and a person who is really infected with COVID, what will be the particle dynamics. And then you can see that the second video basically talks about the infected person in a metro-like environment or a enclosed environment. Of course, in this case, it's a public transport, but any enclosed environment, a person wearing mask, a person without wearing mask, how does the nearby people get infected, how the particle gets stuck to a particular surface, stuck to a particular person, so on. Like a lot of scenarios can be performed over here. Of course, like Mr. Kang mentioned, these are all single person specific simulations, but this is not a limitation. Of course, the limitation only comes from the infrastructure of the systems that we are using, but you can definitely extend these studies to multi-person studies to understand if multiple people are infected in a certain specific enclosed environment, how does that really look? On this same aspect, we as a company also started releasing licenses and computational support for people who are interested in doing COVID-based studies. So these are free licensing, free computational support for doing extensive research in the areas of COVID and pandemic. We also partnered with NSCC, where we have provided NSCC the complete simulation platform, and NSCC is kind enough to offer their HPC infrastructure for the people in Singapore to do this sort of COVID research. And I think all of you should try to make use of that. Now, the other is the particle dynamics through the cloth. So if you notice here, let me switch on my pointer. Yeah. So we have modeled this mask in as realistic sense as possible. Now, how are we modeling this mask? The mask is modeled by discrete element particles. So these are multiple particles interacting with each other and representing the cloth itself. So how a realistic mask or a cloth will really, behave in the scenario of somebody sneezing. Now, we have given the porosity to this mask as realistic as, let us say, a surgical mask. And then we introduce sneezing. Now, sneezing, we are basically taking a typical sneezing condition, which is from a reference material or, let us say, a literature. And then the particle density, the diameter are all considered. And we are basically performing this to understand, first of all, how the filtration happens through a typical surgical mask, plus also trying to study the scalability, because we are all talking about high performance computing. Definitely these type of simulations cannot be easily performed within a simple workstation sort of an environment. So we are definitely requiring a high performance computing. So as you can see, this particular calculation required a 144 core processor to perform just a typical physical time of 2 seconds. So a typical sneeze time is within 2 seconds. So we do the complete pre-sneeze and post-sneeze cycle so that you are able to track the particle moving out of the mask itself. Now, in this process, so this particularly gives the scalability study, like how is it that HPC is going to add value to the speed at which you are going to get the outcome. So this is an example of how the time versus the particle count, that is the number of particle counts, if you start increasing, your time is going to be very critical. You're going to use up more computation time. And how does that impact the parallelization? That is, you using multiple cores, and then how are you able to reduce the speed up of your entire outcome? So what you can understand from here is the importance of HPC and the importance of scalability in doing these sort of complex simulation outcomes. Then I've just taken some examples of how a 3D tomography, of, let us say, lung, has really supported in airway manipulation and targeted drug delivery. Now, this is an example where we are taking 3D tomography of lungs. Of course, we can do this through CT imaging, CT scanning. And then we use the AI platform to understand pneumonia pattern. Now, there is a certain specific pneumonia pattern which the COVID develops, and a normal non-COVID pneumonia pattern. We try to understand the difference. And based on that, we see the severity of this particular COVID infection to understand what type of drug delivery systems are required. So one basic drug delivery system is the intubation, the endotracheal intubation, where the tube is directly inserted and the drug is delivered to the site. That is, when I say site, in this case, to the lung. This same methodology can be performed for any other aerosol applications also. And then one very interesting research, of course, this was an academic research by Yale, and we found it very interesting to even do a CFD-based simulation. Of course, this was an experimental activity where the ventilators were of shortage, I think, in almost every country. That is, one reason is because these are single patient ventilators. So one ventilator will be used by one patient was the norm until COVID. Now, during the COVID, while people wanted to use a lot of ventilators, I think there was a study through which this multi-patient ventilator system was developed. So with multi-patient ventilator, at least 2 to 4 patients can use the same ventilator. So what happens here is definitely understanding the safety, right? And how these controls are basically functioning through control valve methods. That is where engineering simulation helps to understand whether it is safe for different patients to use the same ventilator. How can they use different bypass valves to control the movement of particles or air, which is exhaled by one patient, does not travel to the other patient, and so on. So this is a slightly intricate flow study, which can be done with the help of CFD and then validated with experiments. Quickly moving forward, apart from COVID study, I also wanted to introduce very quickly on how engineering simulations are really helping in the advancement of healthcare. So one is definitely starting with the design and engineering itself. So whether it is the biomechanical kinetics, biokinetics, or so what example you see here is there are 3 different sectors. The first 2 images are talking about the biokinetics, right? How your joints are functioning, what are the stresses that are experienced on the bone joints for different activities. The first one is like when you play a golf, what is your mechanics or kinetics in the body and so on. The second is understanding how human and medical equipment interact with each other. So in this case, it's a very simple example of a human being laying on a hard surface. Now, when this person is laying, how does the hard surface and the body interact? What is the type of forces that the human body experiences? And what are the deformations that the human body experiences? Now, that is another study. The third is addressing a stunt, a more of a surgical procedure in different scenarios. Now, how a person designs a stunt for different situations, whether it has to go through bends, it has to go through twisting conditions, crushing conditions, and so on. So this is where your engineering, design and engineering aspects kicks in. Of course, we can also integrate artificial intelligence into design and engineering at a very, very early stage because we are talking about, let us say, CFD. Now, I told to do a simple 2-second simulation, you need 144 cores and you need, like, let us say 10 hours or 15 hours. Now, to reduce that initial phase of study, we can use artificial intelligence where what we perform is, let us say this is an example of a blood flow. we initially perform a few simulations through CFD or through any other engineering simulation, then train the artificial intelligence to understand these simulations so that moving forward, you just change the parameters and then the AI tool typically gives you the outcome, what a CFD or any other engineering software might have provided. So that way what happens, you are reducing the simulation time drastically. So let us say an FVA simulation or a CFD simulation takes about 3 hours to do a certain simulation. Now with artificial intelligence, it may not take more than a second to give the outcome. So it's all prediction and learning, a continuous prediction and learning method. Then of course, this is a lot more advanced application where you use surgical planning through biomodeling. Okay, so where the simulation comes into picture here is, of course, you use a CT imaging, that is, you scan a particular part, convert that particular part into 3D rendered data, into cloud-based components, then you 3D print them, and then use the 3D printed model to perform surgical planning, surgical guided simulations, and so on. So I'll just give an example of a skull of human body, which is having a certain, tumor. Now, what happened over here is the medical or the surgeon typically scans this particular skull, recreates the skull through 3D printing, does a pre-surgical methodology study, and then does this on the human body itself. So what are we trying to do here is the complete surgical reconstruction so that you do not put the patient on risk of this surgery, because these are highly complex surgery. So you perform it virtually or you perform it on a biomodeled entity and then put it to use. This is of course usage of 3D printing or advanced manufacturing, you can say. This was an example of how our Belgium team really took a generic CAD model from a simple online source to 3D print with available facility and help the local hospitals and the local agencies to make face shields, which was very, very essential. So this is how your 3D printing technology really comes into picture to quickly and outturn the entire development time and usability. Advanced needles is of course the future. Here again, a lot of simulation comes into picture. I've just taken an example of a needle-free syringe. I think most of you may be aware the future is about needle-free drug delivery. So when I talk about needle-free drug delivery, it's all about shock waves. So I know that most of you are aware shock waves are typical aerospace terminologies, but now the medical industry is planning to use the shock wave technology to disperse medicine into nanoparticles that can enter your skin directly. Why is this needed? Of course, healthy people do not really use syringes on a daily basis, but we are talking about people who are diabetic, who are chronic, who have chronic illness, who have to regularly be exposed to syringes onto their skin. Now, that is not a very pleasant experience for them. So it is for helping those people, we are coming up with these sort of needle-free drug delivery systems. And of course, micro and nano needles, which are the patches. Already the medical industry are using a lot of patches, primarily to as a function of pain killing. So these patches again have nano needles, micro needles through which the drugs are going to flow in a very, like a surface tension based flows, we call it as. So these surface tension based flows are again very complex fluid dynamic scenarios, which has to be simulated and understood before even doing these sort of drug patches. Muscle modeling is another area. This is an example of obstructive sleep apnea where the tongue was recreated using MRI images, and then the movement of tongue is done using CAD and the simulation, the CAE simulation. And we basically try to understand how this tongue movement is obstructing your airflow. Now, because of the obstruction of airflow, you have sleep apnea. So this basically gives an understanding of what is the cause of sleep apnea and how can you basically address this issue. Because of interest of time, I'll just quickly move through these. So these are pre-surgical, post-surgical support through simulations. So I've just taken an example of hemodynamics where you have angio embrittlement, which is nothing but the rupture of the veins because of accumulation of blood and weakness of the nervous system. This typically happens for old age people where you see brain hemorrhages, internal hemorrhages. And how do we do this with simulation? So we do a pre-surgical simulation where we have taken the CT image, converted into CAD, done the blood flow analysis, understood the stresses that are acting on the surfaces of this vein, and then we reinforce it. Typically, reinforcement happens by, let us say, a stunt. Now, when we put a stunt over here, how the reinforcement happens and how the pre-surgical, post-surgical blood flow is established. So all these can be performed using engineering simulation. Similar application to heart valves, starting from the functioning of heart valve, how the failure of heart valves happen, and so on. I'll skip through these. And then you can see the kinematics, the walking kinematics. This is an example of an academic research where a robotic human prosthetic is basically integrated into a human body. And we are trying to understand the walking kinematics integrated to human body. So basically, we build the human body, build the joints, build the soft tissues and everything that are essential to study, and then integrate the robotic or the prosthetic and study the integration between human body behavior and the prosthetic behavior. Then the study of the entire human model itself, that is the JAWS model. Normally, we use these type of models for all particulate studies or understanding the metabolic activities of a human body. So we call it as JAWS. These are all thermoregulation models of the human body, where you study the body at different levels, that is at a fat level, at a skin level, blood pool, vein, and then eventually come up with a thermal model where you try and understand whether the human being is comfortable, not comfortable, whether they are perspiring, not perspiring, and so on. Like these sort of thermal models can be used in various studies. Coming to the last part of my presentation, that is, what are the key takeaways of using engineering simulations in healthcare? So why is it so important to consider engineering simulations before even going for any trials or any, the prototyping and so on? Of course, always the first answer to this is engineering simulation has always reduced the need for physical prototypes. Definitely, there used to be times where engineering simulations were not stable, they were not accurate, but in the current times, these are the most accurate outcomes, and you can always rely on engineering simulation before even going for physical prototypes. That way, there is a lot of cost reduction. You understand different performance scenarios through virtual testings and so on. Then you can also test different products in representation to better plan critical and important trials. So before even going for clinical trials or surgical performance, you can use engineering simulation to do these at a representational level before even doing at a realistic stage. Then you can also predict the performance, the durability. If you are using new material, then engineering simulation always helps you in predicting their performance at a biomechanic level also. These are also alternate designs and reduces your design cycle. So that is very important nowadays in a medical scenario and so on. So I think you can get faster approval. So this is just a statement, but I think a lot of medical device manufacturers are now taking resort of simulation and including simulation in their report to basically speed up the approvals from regulatory bodies and define through different histories of files. So that way they get faster approvals to regulatory bodies. With this, I conclude my presentation with a note that we do have a user conference coming up. This is a virtual user conference on the 2nd and 3rd, where you will get to really see a live outcome of different customers using MSc products for different applications. So please do try to attend this event. Thank you so much. Thanks to NSCC. Thanks to everybody attending this webinar. Thank you.
Everyone. So before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to briefly describe what HPC is, especially to our audience who are not so familiar with it. High performance computing, or just HPC, is also known as the supercomputer. HPC is essentially a super fast computer, consists of many computation nodes, usually from hundreds, ranges from hundreds to 100,000s. Each computation node is pretty much like your general purpose computer you use every day. In the case of HPC, all the nodes can be used simultaneously to perform calculation in parallel. I think most of us have observed job parallelization in our daily lives. Let's say in NTUC price or any supermarket, having 10 checkout counters is obviously better than having 2 because it runs the jobs faster. It's the same concept with HPC. When a job may take a year on your notebook, can run in maybe a few hours on a HPC system. Since early 2020, HPC has been used to tackle problems posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, including our own HPC system at NSCC. We have approved projects related to COVID-19 research in a special call for projects. In other parts of the world, HPC systems are specially commissioned for this purpose, such as the COVID-19 consortium in US, which has roughly 600 petaflops, and also not forgetting Fugaku in Japan, which is the fastest HPC in the world, as well as HPC 5 and Marconi 100 in Italy, which are in the list of the top 10 fastest HPC in the world. These massive efforts coming from academia, government agencies, and industries allow researchers to run simulations or calculations related to COVID-19 with unprecedented computational resources. These results are translated, as you've seen in Dr. Kang's or Kartik's presentations. They are translated into treatments, strategies, and policies which have impacted all of us. Okay, so let me take a look at the questions. So if any one of you have questions to ask, you can click on the Q&A, or you may raise your hand if you prefer to speak directly. So let me check the first question. These questions from Ronald Chang should be directed to Dr. Kang. Based on your studies, does coughing or breathing provide a higher risk, since breathing produces more smaller droplets which stay in the air longer and evaporate more slowly than larger droplets, as you mentioned? Chang?
Okay. So actually, this is, we have to look at different perspective. Because coughing and breathing, they have different expulsion forces. They have different droplet size distribution. And also because coughing usually is a one-time off event and breathing is a cumulative process. From what our study is that the larger of the droplets will actually contain more viruses. That is actually derived from the graph that I show during the presentation. So you didn't taking that into consideration. So larger droplet will have larger amount of the virus. Then in that case, it probably will have a higher risk if the persons that be short distance, short durations as compared to maybe a long period of talking or long period of breathing process. Yes.
Oh, thank you, Chang Wei. I think there's a person who just raised Henry. Would you like to speak now? Hi. Hi. How should I address you? Hello. You are muted. Is it Sun? X Sun? Hello.
Sorry, I don't have any question.
Oh, okay. It's fine. Okay. I don't see any other questions right now, so I think we begin our panel discussion by asking the first question to Chang. What is the most interesting trend for 2020, especially in this pandemic time?
So this year, I think is a very interesting year. I mean, we embarked on this study since early of the year. So if you ask about the interesting trend, of course not on this pandemic outbreak, but for personal view is that it's a very close collaboration that actually we have. As you can see over the talk that I've shared, so we actually work very closely among the team, within the A-star, across different sectors, like for example, engineering to biomedicals, as well as with all the support from different agencies. So that is a very fruitful and appreciative collaboration that I think is make this year very special from my point of view.
Okay.
Over, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chang Wei. I believe there are, I'm pretty sure there are new collaborations between industry and academia due to COVID-19. Maybe Karthik, you can share with us some of the stories coming from industry.
Yeah. So I think continuing to the point what Mr. Kang mentioned, there is definitely a lot of synergy now between academic research and medical research. Okay, so what I mean to say is we have noticed now the medical industry asking for a lot of things from the engineering divisions. So the recent one such example is where the doctors want to really understand how a catheter performs in different scenarios and how specifically can they make catheter for patients, right? So I think, as you all know, catheters are common in shape, but now the doctors want something specific to a patient. So now these sort of requirements is what I see as an engagement between the medical industry and the academic industry. And I think one very interesting activity which I noticed is there is a research synergy that is happening between an engineering institution and a medical institution. I'm not even talking about industry communicating with each other, but I am talking about at an education level also, people have started to communicate with each other. Two different streams of education are communicating with each other, in this case, medical and engineering, because I think that is the need of the day. And with COVID, with this pandemic, we all wanted some immediate help from different societies of people, and that's one area I think this people have started to explore immediately.
Yeah, thank you, Karthik. I have one question for Chang Wei. It's about your research. We always heard some misconceptions when it comes to droplet spread from coughing. How do you think we can combat these misconceptions and communicate more effectively?
I see. Thanks, Tong Yuan. So usually when misconception arise because of lack of information, because of lack of effective communication, as you rightly pointed out. So what actually this brings the beauty of modern estimation, right? So in this current stage, what actually we do is we try our best to incorporate the right physics to benchmark it, so that we actually can visualize how the droplets being spread, how the droplets actually in flight in the air, lingering in the air, So when you with visualizations, then people are more able to interpret and understand better. And of course, beside that, we also can go one more level whereby we actually can quantify the number of droplets, quantify the number of virus copy, that given different granularity of the information, and that will provide a better understanding on how the risk of the transmission is.
Okay.
Over, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Uh, Let me think. I think what are some of the ways people from your field or industry are making a difference in the world affected by COVID-19? Maybe I think you can answer this.
Yeah, so as an industry, we offer multiple technologies, right? So during COVID, I think as a company, we were able to contribute in different areas. One very important area is 3D printing, which I spoke about during my presentation as well. The other is how we can use 3D scanning technology to understand the body physics more accurately. Then, of course, particle dynamics is one area we have done a lot of research, and we have tried to understand many things like mitigating infection transmissions, or whether it is distancing and how effective distancing is, or what is the effectiveness of wearing a mask, what is the effectiveness of wearing a shield, and so on. I mean, the possibilities are very high. And with the technologies that we have, we see a lot of applications, if not for only pandemic, but for any future mitigation. So like everyone is saying, COVID is not the first and the last. So there are going to be many such scenarios. And it is with these technologies, we would want to be more prepared. So I think as a company, we want to be future prepared. We want to have that awareness of being prepared for a pandemic like this rather than being caught surprised. I think that is one specific area we are really working on.
Thank you for your answer. I think there's a questions from the audience from Chi Kwang. I think it's directed. Given the difficulty of modeling, how long does it take to develop something to run on the supercomputer? How realistic is it to rapidly model a situation in a short time span, such as during the beginning of the COVID outbreak? I think, Chang, maybe you can answer this.
Sure. So as just I shared that we start this work early, sometime in March. The reason because there are a lot of what Tong Yen mentions, a lot of lack of information, a lot of insight. So therefore, we quickly assembles a couple of computer scientists with fluid dynamic background. So because we have some of the background that we have some of the capability that we have built over the years. So we are able to actually build up the models. We are able to actually verify, benchmark the model in a very relatively quicker manner. But of course, when we start to engage, we start to expand the study to different kind of setting and scenario. That is whereby there are more compute resources that require. That is where we actually approach NSCC. So thanks to Prof Tan and the team that actually support very much to provide all the resources for us to actually respond in time. So speed to action is very important, as the questions mentioned, because that will give you the perspective, the informations that require to make any decision.
Okay.
Over, thank you.
Okay. I hope that answers your question, Ji Kwang. So I guess we have to come to the end of this webinar session. Remember to contact NSCC, Chang Wei or Karthik, you have any further questions, or perhaps just curious about the possibility of using HPC in your work. Before I let Aditya do the closing, I would like to thank our two speakers, Karthik and Chang Wei, for their presentations, and also some of their insights in the CAE simulations. And also not forgetting my colleagues who work very hard to organize this webinar. Actually, not just this webinar, but all the previous and also the future ones. Lastly, a huge applause for all the participants for being here today and giving to interact with our panel speakers. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Dr. Kang,
Thanks
Mr.
to all.
Karthik, and Dr. Lee for the great and insightful sharing. And thank you to everyone for the questions as well as your time. Both speakers have shared their email addresses, so please feel free to get connected with them after this session. The recording of this session will also be uploaded at NSCC's YouTube channel, so do head there for a review of today's event. So that concludes today's session on Pandemic Proofing Society. Do keep an eye out for NSCC's next webinar happening in December. Details will be posted on our website and social media channels. So see you at our next online event. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.